we're reminded that Western civilization's defense did not come lightly, and we're going to bridge into some of what the costs were over the course of the next hour or so with our next guest. So, Michael Ward is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall, University of Oxford. He's the author of the award-winning and best-selling Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis by Oxford University Press, and co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis under the Cambridge University Press. Though based in Oxford, Dr. Ward is also employed as professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University in Texas. On the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, back in November of 2013, Professor Ward unveiled a permanent national memorial to Lewis in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey. He is the co-editor of a volume of commemorative essays marking the anniversary entitled C.S. Lewis at Poets' Corner, published in 2016. Michael Ward presented the BBC One television documentary The Narnia Code in 2009 and authored an accompanying book entitled The Narnia Code, C.S. Lewis and the Secret of the Seven Heavens. He was resident warden of the Kilns, Lewis's Oxford home, from 1996 to 1999. He studied English at Oxford, theology at Cambridge, and has a PhD in divinity from St. Andrews. However, at King's, we know engaging the culture is a very important element of what we're here to do. And so I'm happy to report that perhaps Dr. Ward's greatest claim to fame is that he handed a pair of X-ray spectacles to Agent 007 in the James Bond film, The World Is Not Enough. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please join me in welcoming Michael Ward.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a cold Monday night in March. And before I begin, may I make a preemptive sort of excuse if I seem slightly spacey. I only got into New York last night, so I'm kind of 5 hours ahead of you on my body clock, so it's getting on for midnight, as far as I'm concerned. I just say that in my own defense. But I'm going to talk about, well, under the title, Narnia, Middle-earth and the Great War, I'm going to talk principally about Narnia and the Great War, and we can leave Middle-earth for the Q&A time and the conversation I will have with Joe Loconte. But I want to talk principally about C.S. Lewis and his experiences in the First World War. I'll speak for 20 minutes, and then Joe and I will, then we will watch a trailer, and then Joe and I will have a chat, and we'll open to Q&A. So C.S. Lewis was given a commission in the British Army and sent off to France in 1917. He arrived in the French trenches on his 19th birthday, and here is Lewis at the age of 19. He served for 6 months in the Somerset Light Infantry. Some of that time he was in hospital with trench fever, but he recovered from the trench fever just in time to go back to the front line in order to face the final German attack of the spring of 1918. This is the only photograph of Lewis in uniform that is known to exist. It was discovered just a couple of years ago in the archive of Keble College, Oxford, where he did his officer's training. And this is the close-up on Lewis himself. He was very nearly killed in a battle near the town of Arras in the spring of 1918. A British shell that was flying over towards the Germans fell short and landed in his own trench, annihilating the man next to him, spattering Lewis full of shrapnel, one or two little bits of which he carried around in his body for the rest of his life. And he had an out-of-body experience. He looked down on his body from a great height, and the thought came to him, here is a picture of a man dying. He thought he was about to lose his life. But of course he didn't. He survived just by a hair's breadth and was invalided back to England and spent a further 6 months recovering from his war wounds. So his total war experience was really about 18 months in total, 6 months training, so to speak, not that it consisted of very much useful training, then 6 months in France, 6 months back in England recuperating. The First World War, of course, though, was not the only war that Lewis experienced. 20 or so years later, the Second World War broke out, and Lewis, by that stage, was in a reserved occupation as a professor at Oxford, and was in any case virtually too old to serve, even if he hadn't been in a reserved occupation. But he viewed as his war work in the Second World War the talks that he was invited to give to the men of the Royal Air Force. And here's a photograph of Lewis during the Second World War with the chaplains of the RAF. Lewis went around RAF stations giving talks to the young fighter pilots whose life expectancy by that stage was usually measured not in years but in months or even in weeks. So it was a very vital work that Lewis was doing as far as he was concerned. And because of his own experiences in the First World War, the young men of the RAF listened to him with respect, because they knew that what he had to say about the war had been, as one of the chaplains put it, forged in a furnace, not stored in a glacier. Now, there's a lot that could be said about the impact that the two wars had on Lewis's life and his work generally, but I have time only to talk about the effect that I think it had on his fiction writing, and in particular the Narnia Chronicles. As was said in the introduction, I've written this book, Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, and it was accompanied by this BBC documentary, The Narnia Code. And in my work, I try to demonstrate my belief that the Narnia Chronicles are keyed, they are imaginatively structured upon the imagery of the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos. What are the seven heavens of the medieval cosmos? Well, they are these, if you don't remember. In the medieval understanding, the Earth was surrounded not by empty space, but by a series of ranked concentric spheres or heavens, each heaven with its own planet, and each planet with its own influences that it would shed upon the Earth, and people and events, and even the metals in Earth's crust. And here they are in ascending order from the Earth. The Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These are the seven heavens, and above the planetary heavens came the spheres of the fixed stars. Here's a slightly more detailed diagram of that old cosmological arrangement as it was believed to be. If you kept pushing up through the fixed stars, you would eventually emerge into the uncreated home of God, the Caelum Empyreum Habitaculum Dei et Omnium Electorum. Now, C.S. Lewis, as a medieval scholar, knew all about this cosmological arrangement. And if you know his English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, as I'm sure you all do, isn't that a snappy title? It was part of this multi-volume series of books about the whole history, the Oxford history of English literature, which Lewis abbreviated to Oh Hell. This was his Oh Hell volume. It took him about 15 years to write this book. And if you read this book, which I encourage you to do, it's a very good read, you will discover that it opens with a long discussion of the new astronomy that came in the 16th century thanks to the work of Nicholas Copernicus. Because it was Copernicus, of course, who theorized that actually we don't live in a geocentric cosmos, we live in a heliocentric one. The sun is the center, not the Earth, and we go around the sun doesn't go around us. And that was a major revolution in the history of human thought. In a sense, Copernicus relocated Earth. We had thought we were central. Copernicus showed us that we are peripheral. So Copernicus is kind of a big deal. That's why Lewis opens his magisterial survey of the literature of the 16th century with a discussion of the new astronomy. He was really interested in it from a scholarly point of view. And it's not just in his Oh Hell volume where we find this interest, but also in his last academic book, The Discarded Image. 3 times in this book, Lewis encourages his readers to take a walk under the sky at night, looking up at the night sky as if they were still living in the medieval mindset, as if they still believed that they were surrounded by these heavens and influences were raining down upon them. We don't believe the universe to be like this anymore, and that's why Lewis calls his book The Discarded Image. We've got rid of that cosmological image in almost every respect. In one respect, of course, we retain it, because, of course, it's from those 7 heavens that we take the names of the days of the week. Why is today Monday? Because it's the day of the moon. Why was yesterday Sunday? Because it was the day of the sun. Why is tomorrow Tuesday? Well, you have to think in Spanish there, martes, or mardi in French, but tier is the Norse equivalent of the Roman god Mars. And it's about Mars, the god of war, that I want to talk in the next, I think I've got 12 minutes left. Lewis was interested in this 7-fold symbolic scheme, partly because it was everywhere presupposed in medieval literature. I mean, think of Dante. Dante could not have written a Divine Comedy without this scheme as his backdrop. You think of the Paradiso, the 3rd part of the Divine Comedy, where the pilgrim mounts up through the 7 heavens in his ascent to God's throne. Here's an illustration from an edition of the Divine Comedy, and it shows you the 7 planetary characters in the order of the days of the week. So there on the left you have the sun in his burning fiery chariot for Sunday. Then to Monday, the moon goddess in her silvery gown holding the crescent moon. Then we come to Mars for Martes in his helmet and his chainmail, the god of war. Then Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. But I want to talk about Mars and another medieval writer who used the planetary symbol so extensively, and indeed Mars in particular, was not Dante but Chaucer. And here's a page of notes that I found in C.S. Lewis's handwriting. This is the end leaves of his own complete Chaucer, and he's making notes here about Chaucer's Knight's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. You see it says at the top there, Knight's Tale. And Lewis admired the way that Chaucer used the planetary characters in the Knight's Tale. He said that Chaucer didn't just put the planetary characters in as actors in the drama, but he wove the appropriate influences into the plot so that the climax of the Knight's Tale happens on a Tuesday, on Martes. How appropriate for a story about knights. Lewis said this: the characters of the planets seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Of Saturn we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, of Jupiter? The characters of the planets have a permanent value, in Lewis's view, as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Now, Lewis's generation was the generation that went through the First World War, and all too many of his generation did not come out of it. That's why he says of Saturn we know more than enough, because Saturn was associated with death and disaster. But he might just as well have said, of Mars we know more than enough. But who does not need to be reminded of Jupiter? Jupiter was the best planet, the symbol of kingship. How appropriate to be talking about Jupiter in the King's College. The magnanimous, jovial, festive, tranquil symbol was Jupiter. And that was why Lewis began the Narnia Chronicles, I believe, with a jovial story in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But he soon turned to Prince Caspian. And Prince Caspian is what I want to focus on in the remaining 8 minutes, because Prince Caspian, I believe, is Lewis's martial story. Lewis, from a very early age, had a fascination with all things martial. Here he is as a young boy, maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 perhaps, and he wasn't much older than that when he wrote, or at least began to write, a story entitled To Mars and Back. 2 pages of this story survive in Lewis's young script, and it's a remarkable thing that at such a young age he was already fascinated by interplanetary adventure. And although he didn't complete that story when he was only 5 or 6, he would later write a whole novel about a journey to Mars in the first of his cosmic trilogy, the novel Out of the Silent Planet, in which the hero of the story goes all the way to Mars and discovers the Martians, or the Malacandrians as Lewis calls them. And the planetary imagery, the medieval planetary imagery in that novel can't be overlooked. It's absolutely explicit and in your face. When Lewis came to write the Narnia Chronicles a few years later, he took that planetary imagery and used it again, I believe, but this time not in an explicit fashion, not in a fashion that draws your attention, but in a much subtler way, in a subliminal fashion. It gets beneath the radar of your attention, so that each of the Narnia Chronicles is structured and patterned according to the imagery of the given planetary symbol, but in a way which escapes your conscious attention. Now, Prince Caspian is Lewis's Mars story, I believe. This is his Narnia Chronicle, which is, as it were, inspired by, written to the blueprint of all things martial. The children discover their weapons in the armory of the ruins of Cair Paravel. The boys harden into knights, they go off to battle. Military imagery, military episodes are everywhere in this story. And the word martial itself appears a couple of times. Reepicheep is described as a martial mouse, and King Miraz frets over his martial policy. We also hear about the hereditary marshals of lists in something of a martial pun. And if you saw the recent film version of Prince Caspian, you may remember how they went to town on the battle scenes. But you might say that there are battles in many of the Narnia books, and you'd be right. So what makes this a peculiarly martial story? Well, it's partly the centrality of those martial episodes, but what really clinches it, actually, is a theme of martial symbolism, which isn't obviously connected to warfare, but rather to woods and forests. Because according to Roman mythology, Mars was not always and only the god of war. He was originally a vegetation deity. He was called Mars Silvanus. Here's a mural from Pompeii showing you Mars in both capacities. He's the god of war, yes, he's got his shield and his spear and his helmet, but he's standing against a backdrop of burgeoning vegetation. The month of March is consecrated to Mars. That's why we call the third month of the year March, because in that month of the year, well, first of all, the weather is getting good enough for armies to march off to battle again, should they want to, but the trees are coming back to life at the same time. So in Prince Caspian, you get both themes of imagery running through the whole tale. All the military imagery, yes, but all the woodland imagery as well. Remember how Lucy tries to wake the trees, how the Telmarines are frightened of the forests, how Aslan is seen first of all in the story amongst dancing trees. And here in this particular image from Prince Caspian, one of the Pauline Baynes illustrations, we see both elements of the martial imagery in a single picture. A single combat between Peter and Miraz in the foreground, and in the background you can make out the trees, the dryads, the hammer dryads, and the Sylvans. And it's only in Prince Caspian that Lewis ever talks about Narnian Sylvans. It's a very deliberate nod to Mars Silvanus. The whole structure of Prince Caspian is designed to be permeated with this martial spirit. And Aslan embodies it. He is the true Mars, as it were. Now, why would Lewis want to make his Christ character symbolized by a pagan god? Well, there's a long backstory as to why that would be the case, and we could spend a whole lecture on that idea of transferred classicism, as Lewis calls it, whereby classical mythology is appropriated and baptized for Christian purposes, turned to Christian effect. Transferred classicism, Lewis says, is a technique that medieval and Renaissance poets used up until the time of Milton. It's the best means of writing poetry, of writing imaginative literature, which is religious without being devotional. And everyone is in the secret, Lewis points out. So there's a good literary heritage behind this idea of using mythological tropes and images for Christian purposes. But I think one of the reasons Lewis wanted to do this was, as it were, to frustrate those people who were expecting the Narnia books to be simple, children's literature. On the face of it, they're terribly accessible. On the face of it, they're even a little bit of a mishmash, a hodgepodge, full of apparently unconnected elements and disparate mythological traditions. But actually, Lewis, as the author of the Narnia books, he is to Narnia as God is to our world. He knows what his purposes are. He knows that everything in this story is infused with a martial spirit which Aslan, as it were, incarnates or embodies. And even seemingly little irrelevant details contribute to that total martial effect, like the little chess piece that the children discover in the ruins of the castle at the start of the story. This could be any old chess, an unidentified chess piece, a chess king, a chess pawn. But what is it? A chess knight with a little red ruby eye. Because knighthood, chivalry, all things gallant and martial are the inner meaning of this story. There are no accidents. There is nothing beyond the purposes of the Narnian creator, that is to say, C.S. Lewis. He knows what his purposes are, even though the children in the story and even though the readers of the story may not at first work out what those purposes are. Likewise, when we go through horrific experiences, like a First World War battlefield, we may throw up our hands and say, how can God possibly be bringing anything good out of this? How can providential designs be working their purposes out for good, for those who love God, as the scriptures tell us? Well, it's hard for us to see how, but in the mind of God, actually, there may well be, and Lewis believed that there was indeed, a good purpose being worked out somehow, mysteriously. Beyond our understanding, absolutely. Nobody could possibly explain every detail. But Lewis believed in principle that it was there in the mind of God. So in a sense, what Lewis is giving us, I think, is a fully scriptural understanding of the hidden God. Surely thou art a God who hidest thyself, as the prophet Isaiah says. But hiding himself for good purposes. Think of those purposes of the Christian life which St. Paul talks about in the New Testament. About fight the good fight. Be a good soldier of Christ Jesus. Put on the whole armor of God. Think of the Old Testament as picturing God as the Lord of hosts, mighty in battle. And the trees of the field shall clap their hands. The Mars Sylvanus imagery is there in the scriptures too, if we have eyes to see it. So although Lewis lived through 2 world wars, was nearly killed in one, and went around speaking to young men who would very soon be killed in the other, speaking to a generation which had very good reason on the face of it, ostensibly, for throwing up its hands and saying, this is a bleak universe. This is a meaningless universe. Yes, on the face of it, we have to concede that it very often does look like that. But in the inner workings of the secret counsels of the divine authority who is overseeing the whole of creation and everything in it, there may be a different story being told. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Amazing. We could just listen to you here for the next 5 hours. We don't have that time. We're going to see a 4.5-minute trailer from a film project that I'm working on based on the little book I did a couple of years ago, A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and a Great War. And Michael is featured in that film, so we're going to go to it right now.
Near the center of every great story is a great conflict, a great war. Two soldiers, each with a gift for storytelling, survive the storm and steel of the greatest war the world had ever seen. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Together, they used their imagination to battle the darkest forces of their age. A hobbit, a wardrobe, and a great war.
The generation of Tolkien and Lewis endured unspeakable loss in a war that they believed would advance the cause of humanity, the war to end all wars. Instead, the funeral of a great myth is about to begin.
And the rise of technology opens a window into the human heart. We're so clever. Look at all these wonderful scientific inventions we have. And what do we use them for? Destroying each other.
When war came, they thought it would be over very quickly. They had no idea that it would turn out to be the worst conflict up to that time in human history.
The tanks, the mortars, the machine guns. No soldier who fought in this war could ever forget the terrors of combat. Tolkien and Lewis will remember them well.
One gets a good sense, I think, from both authors, of the frightening quality of battle and the smallness the individual feels.
The essential thing that turned the modern world into what it is was the trauma of the First World War. And of course, both men were right at the heart of it.
And yet, out of the ashes of that conflict, a friendship emerged here, amid the dreaming spires of Oxford.
The friendship between Lewis and Tolkien is really one of the literary masterpieces of all time.
They simply didn't buy into the idea that there's an inevitable progression of humanity upwards into wider and greater knowledge, and that whatever is new is better and truer. They thought that was patently absurd.
How could they actually grapple with their experiences or come to terms with what they had seen? And they were using mythology as a way of doing that.
Tolkien and Lewis had a profound influence on each other. Remember, Lewis went into the war as an atheist, and he came out as an atheist. Without the presence of Tolkien in his life, he might never have shaken off his existential angst and produced works alive with the themes of faith, hope, and joy. For his part, Tolkien once admitted that were it not for Lewis's great encouragement, he never would have brought to a conclusion his epic trilogy. He needed Lewis's constant prodding and demands for more.
You know what Jack Lewis was like. He was such a boy. He had to have a story. And that story, The Lord of the Rings, was written to keep him quiet.
Imagine a world without The Lord of the Rings and without the Chronicles of Narnia. If it wasn't for the friendship between Lewis and Tolkien, we would have neither.
Lewis said, well, since children are going to grow up in a world of dragons and giants, let us at least show the children that dragons and giants can be overcome.
The key character that emerges from Lord of the Rings is Samwise Gamgee. He is the hobbit that is just the normal person. He's a gardener. But at the end of the day, he achieves the final quest. And Tolkien sees him as the epitome of the average British soldier.
True heroism is hobbit-sized. It's in the everyday heroism of somebody who says, I don't know the way.
The hobbit is the small character who is sort of overlooked by all the great ones of the world, but it's on the hobbit's obedience and courage and endurance that Middle-earth is saved. Likewise, Lucy saves the day in Prince Caspian. So you don't have to be, the strong man. You don't have to be, armed to the teeth. You just need to do your duty.
Tolkien and Lewis are casting a vision for a better world and inviting us to be caught up in it.
They saw not an irrelevant other world in which you could escape, but curious enough, exactly the diagnostic tool that they needed to critique the world that they were in. And they did so to devastating effect.
They are fundamental texts. They're incredibly important introductions to some of the most profound questions that Western civilization has raised about the human condition. If we lose the ability to communicate the value of these books to the next generation, then I shall fear for our civilization.
Their great hope was to re-enchant the world through Christian faith and pagan beauty. In many ways, against all expectations, that's exactly what they did.
A hobbit, a wardrobe, and a great war.
This whole theme of war, yeah, here it is. This whole theme of war, which I think, not only to my generation, but especially our students here, that you've grown up with these kind of ambiguous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we're not sure how to think about war in many ways in our own time. Here's what you say about in your chapter on Mars here, Michael. Lewis divided the poets of war into the enchanted, people like Sidney, Macaulay, Chesterton, Brooke, the disenchanted, like Sassoon, and the re-enchanted, like Homer. And he obviously intends to include himself among the re-enchanted. One is not in the least deceived. We remember the trenches too well, Lewis says. We know how much of the reality, the romantic view left out, but we also know that heroism is a real thing. And I wanted to ask you about that, why you think it was so important for Lewis to communicate this particular view of war, chivalry, heroism in his own day. Why was it so important for him through the Chronicles of Narnia, not just in perhaps one of the books, but throughout the books? And then in our own day, is that message still as relevant, as important? What's your sense of that? I know it's a big couple of questions. Take a whack at it, would you?
Well, Lewis wrote a fine little article called The Necessity of Chivalry during the Second World War, in which he said that the knight, the gallant, self-controlled soldier in arms in defense of a good cause is a work of art. It's not a work of nature. You need to be very self-disciplined. You need to have been educated in the right way. You need to be in a well-ordered society, and then the knight will emerge. And the knight is a great work of art, one of the greatest works of art. It's written on the canvas of human nature. And why is it so great? Well, because it brings together two aspects of humanity which are otherwise likely just to fly apart. The ability to risk one's life, the ability to exert one's great strength, but also the ability to be totally self-controlled and utterly self-disciplined so that you don't go a hair's breadth further than necessary. You see it a little bit in Shakespeare, in Henry V, for instance. And I think this is one of the things that he's trying to communicate imaginatively in Prince Caspian. So yes, Peter and Edmund, and indeed Reepicheep, the martial mouse, are knights, but above them and below them, you get the two aspects which they combine perfectly, but which otherwise fly apart. So above them, in terms of excessive violence, you have the hag and the werewolf. These ugly, violent creatures, these cruel creatures who will reach for any weapon of war as long as it serves their war ends. But on the other side, you have the characters who fall beneath. They are the Telmarines, who are these rather dandified, self-indulgent soldiers who don't really know the first thing about warfare. They faff about with their feathered hats and their dappled pommelets. They're rather like the French court in Henry V, Shakespeare's Henry V. But the Narnian warriors combine both, they restrain those two elements from flying apart to the edges. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about Prince Caspian, its depiction of chivalry.
And maybe just a quick follow, then over to you guys. Then a kind of fierceness and a tenderness in that noble knight, which you see also, of course, in Tolkien and characters like Aragorn.
Yes,
right?
Yes. And indeed in Aslan. You know, Aslan is a knightly character. He's, irresistibly tender, but also inexorably stern.
Brilliant. All right, we do want to turn over to you guys right now. Questions from the audience? We've got a microphone right up here, so please come up and tell us who you are And try to, as my dear friend Eric Metaxas loves to say, please frame your question in the form of a question. Keep it nice and tightly worded, but give us a great question if you would. Anybody, the floor is open. Don't be bashful.
I have a question. This five-part film series, Dr. Loconte, that is advertised at the bottom of this, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about that, because I get very excited about that. Dr. Ward, the BBC production that unpacks the idea behind your book, which is Planet Narnia. Tell us where we can get that, because these are really, it's an outrageous resource. And I'm so excited, as you know, about this thesis that I even interviewed you at Socrates in the City. So if people want more than an 18-minute version of it, they can go to the website. But I'm so excited about that. So if you tell us about your documentary and Dr. Loconte about yours.
Okay, well, Planet Narnia and the Narnia Code book and the Narnia Code DVD are all available on Amazon and in good bookshops. So that's all I need to say about their accessibility, I think. Joe?
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for that question. I really appreciate it. So the book I did a couple of years ago, A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and a Great War, the idea there was to try to understand how did the experience of the First World War and then also the Second World War, but particularly the First World War, because both Tolkien and Lewis fought in that war. They come out of that war, and they become friends at Oxford in 1926. And then they go on to write these great epic stories where, if you think about it, war is pretty close, near to the heart of the thing. And so I began to wonder as an historian, not as a professor of literature, but as an historian, how might that searing experience of conflict influence their literary imagination, their careers, their friendships, but particularly their works. So that's what the film tries to do now. It's kind of working off of the book. It's a 5-part film series. We hope to have a couple of episodes ready to sell to Netflix by the end of this year, because in November 11th, 2018, we'll mark the centennial of the end of the First World War. And that's going to be a huge cultural moment, certainly in the UK, but also here in the United States. We'd like to speak into that moment with something like a Christian message. We are trying to raise money for this film, though. I should mention that parenthetically. So we will, you can talk to me after this talk about how we can do that. We got a great trailer. I told Michael this, that I interviewed him after I'd written the book, here now for the film. I wish I'd spoken to him before I'd written the book, because it would have been a much better book, as you can probably suspect. So thank you, Eric, for that question. Other questions?
Hi, I'm visiting from Franciscan University of Steubenville. I'm on spring break at the moment.
Welcome.
And I had a question about the film series. Last semester, I had the pleasure of taking a literature course that was entirely J.R.R. Tolkien. So I was wondering if this film series, one thing my professor emphasized was the Northern theory of courage that you see a lot in Tolkien, as well as C.S. Lewis, this emphasis on courage, that of this fighting without hope. You see that, like in Frodo and Sam, they speak about destroying the ring even if nobody ever knows what they do. I was just wondering if you touch on that, because that was something that really stayed with me from the course I took.
Thank you, yes. In Prince Caspian, as I was saying, you have, I think, one particular take on the virtue of fortitude, the fortitude in the mode of, in an active mode, in resistance to evil, and indeed taking the fight to the enemy. That's one mode of fortitude, but it's not necessarily the highest mode of fortitude. I think I'm channeling Thomas Aquinas here when I say this, that the higher mode of fortitude is actually endurance, long-suffering, sticking to your post even when you know you're going down, which is, I suppose, the Norse theory of courage, which Lewis and Tolkien were so moved by. You find it in the Battle of Maldon, that Anglo-Saxon poem, which Lewis liked to quote in the original Anglo-Saxon. I don't have the Anglo-Saxon. I don't even have the modern English version. But something about the heart shall be stronger, our arm the firmer, as our strength weakens. Even as you are facing death, your spirit grows all the more strong in your desire to resist. And I think you see that mode of fortitude in the last battle in the Narnia series, where King Tyrion and the other faithful Narnians, they begin to see that the tide is turning against them. They realize they're not going to win. This is the last battle that they will fight. Are they going to throw their arms up and throw their weapons away? No, they're not. They're going to go down fighting. And that's the Norse theory of courage for you.
And maybe just to supplement that terrific question, our idea of the heroic is a little bit different, I think, than that of Tolkien and Lewis. It's, as Michael suggested, it's staying at your post and doing your duty despite the odds. And that's kind of a remarkable statement and theme for them to have, it seems to me, in the post-war years after the First World War. Michael, any thoughts on that, perhaps? That they're insisting that there's something decent and noble and right about staying at your post when a whole generation of men had been just obliterated by staying at their posts.
Yeah,
right?
Well, quite. And you can understand why people like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen and the other war poets, as we now know them, were indeed disillusioned by all that they had been told. They'd been sold a false prospectus, as they understood it. And there was nothing noble about it. I mean, there's that Sassoon poem, "You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer as soldier boys go by, creep home and pray, you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go." And you can understand why a man would say that, given what we eventually learnt about the trenches. It was absolute hell on earth. That's not an excessive statement. But the Christian attitude is that hell can be overcome. You know, Christ descends into hell and rises again on the third day. Death does not have the last word, even death on a battlefield in Flanders, which is, you know, one of the most ignominious ways of being killed that you can imagine. So there is a resurrection hope that can relativize the awfulness even of the Great War. But it needs to be embraced with complete seriousness about the cost. And any kind of cheap grace, to quote Bonhoeffer, is just an insult to those who have paid the ultimate price. You know, Christ's grace comes to us through death, not through skating over it or pretending it didn't matter or pretending it wasn't painful. Quite the contrary. It only has its salvific power because it embraced death in its complete darkness and bleakness and still overcame it. And that's what Lewis and Tolkien, as Christians, believed, whereas others, alas, they couldn't retain their faith in the face of those seemingly insurmountable odds.
Yes, and maybe that's another remarkable aspect of their work. These stories, these war stories, there isn't a kind of moral triumphalism about the thing. There's a moral seriousness about those stories. The reality of combat, I have to think that their own experience of combat had to inform their works and the seriousness of it, the sorrow and the grief and the struggle.
Well, exactly. And that's why Lewis says, you know, with an implicit critique of writers like Chesterton and those other people he says are enchanted by war, they haven't really wrestled with the full seriousness of it. But then those who are disenchanted, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen and others, haven't fully realized that there is something beyond it as well. And this is one of the reasons why, you know, in Lewis's case, he goes on to write The Abolition of Man, where he critiques at some length the dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It's sweet and fitting to die for one's country. You know, that's the great cry that Wilfred Owen took up, the Horatian maxim, and says, well, we discover that it's not sweet and fitting to die for your country. Therefore, perhaps the idea of patriotism, the idea of nobility and chivalry and self-sacrifice, maybe it's all rubbish. And you get someone like Robert Graves saying goodbye to all that. and you kick over the traces, and you enter into the absurdism and the nihilism and the general modernism that characterized the 1920s and 30s.
And then you get the pacifism of the 1930s, and Lewis's comment that a terrified and angry pacifism we now know is one of the roads that leads to war.
Exactly.
He says that like in 1940, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Other questions? Other questions? Please come to the front. Come to the microphone.
Good evening. I'm wondering if you see any parallels, given just sort of the way that Lewis and Tolkien are using their literature to explore the war and the way that the world was at that time, and that compared to any sort of literature that's being written today regarding September 11th and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
You go first.
No. No. That's a fascinating question, which I've not given any thought to in terms of the modern day power. Well, I guess part of the challenge, of course, is can we, I want to be hopeful that we can, but can we produce Christian authors, men and women of a really deeply rooted Christian imagination who can look at the world around them and have that transcendent perspective on all of it? I'm not saying those people aren't out there, but I'm not sure they're writing great epic literature at this moment. I'm not aware that they are. It's not really my field. I'm just a modern historian, John Locke specialist. That's kind of my thing. Michael, do you want to?
I'm no expert in modern, that is to say, contemporary literature, but maybe in film it's more evident, I wonder, than in literature. And I say that probably only because on the plane over yesterday, I watched a very interesting documentary about the career of Steven Spielberg, and was reminded about Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan, both of which films tackle the full horror and seriousness of war, but nonetheless end on notes of hope and of recognition of heroism. In the case of the first film, you have the memorial stones being laid on the grave of Oskar Schindler in Jerusalem, Mount of Olives, I think. Is that where he's buried? As one of the righteous among the Gentiles. And in the case of Private Ryan, you have a very similar scene, actually, of a gravestone being honored, which is in a way, that's a kind of, I mean, Spielberg is Jewish, and he talks about his Jewishness rather interestingly and movingly in this documentary. And we can't forget that Christianity and Judaism are intimately linked. The honoring of a grave is a kind of crush note of both death and new life in one, which I suppose is, in a way, that is the cross.
Other questions? Other questions, please. Come to the front.
Paul Mueller, I teach here at King's College with Joe. So this question might be a little bit outside of the scope of what you've talked about, and so if you don't have thoughts on it, you can feel free to pass it. But one thing that I've wondered about in a parallel account between Lewis and Tolkien is, in Tolkien, it's the raising of the Shire, the last scene where they come back and Saruman has sort of wiped out a lot of what the Shire used to be and put up all these ugly buildings and sort of overturned things. And the parallel in Lewis is from that hideous strength with what happens to the Bracton College and Edgestowe, and how they come in and they tear up all the old houses and all the old way things were and build these sort of hideous buildings. And I wonder if you all have thought about those scenes, and if that has anything to do with sort of post-war housing policy in the UK and the way in which they tore down all kinds of old buildings and built all kinds of ugly public buildings in Scotland and other places as well. So if you have thoughts on it, great. If not, that's all right too.
Post-war housing policy. Over to you, Michael.
Well, yeah. I mean, that is one of the most visibly awful effects, the enduring visibly awful effects of the war, that all sorts of marvelous buildings were removed and all sorts of terrible new buildings were put up. Not sure I can say much more than that.
This may or may not be on point here, Francis. It's a fascinating question. We know that both Tolkien and Lewis, because they're still coming of age in the end of the Victorian era. Lewis in Northern Ireland, Tolkien outside of Birmingham, and they're watching the growth of the industrial process and the industrialization, and they don't like it. They deeply resent what this kind of chaotic industrialization at the turn of the century is doing to their beloved England. They don't like it. I mean, I think one of the last letters that Lewis wrote, I mean, a week before he died, was something about they're removing taking out a tree in front of the beautiful beech tree in front of my house, drat them. And then he says, I think, correct me, Michael, if I got this right, he says, I think this is like the worst invention since like the atomic bomb, the idea of industrialization and the modern whatever it is. So they were very, very resistant to that kind of change when it didn't show respect for the natural environment. They both loved taking walking tours, of course, in the English countryside. They went on these walking tours all the time as friends. So to watch it slip away, and I think you see this not only there at the end of those stories, but also kind of throughout. The last march of the Ents is kind of nature having its revenge against the assault, man's assault against nature, it seems to me, is one way to read that last march of the Ents. But Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, quite right. They were both deeply anti-industrial, anti-machine in more general terms. They could possibly be critiqued for being a bit Luddite in some respects, but in other respects, their resistance is challenging. Lewis himself never drove a car. I mean, that was partly because he couldn't, but I don't think he would have, even if he could have. And he didn't like being driven very much. And he said, one of the problems with the car is that it annihilates space. It just removes one whole dimension of reality which God has given to us. If you don't like space, then why not creep into your coffin now? There's little enough space there, he says. Why not just move at a human rate, or at any rate on the back of an animal, rather than shooting along at 70, 90 miles an hour? I mean, who am I to speak? I've just flown over the Atlantic. So obviously, there are good uses, but in bringing me to you, but it's a two-edged sword, very definitely. And I don't think we give enough recognition of the downsides.
Well said. How are we doing on time? One or two more. Okay, please.
Hi. Been many years since I studied Tolkien in an academic setting, almost 30 years. But you touched on a very interesting point in terms of how the characterizations that Lewis and Tolkien interact with the martial impulse in their writing. And coming from a Jewish tradition, I see a real dichotomy between them. On the one hand, you have Lewis's use, of very much of a unified sort of Christ figure, whereas Tolkien has got the messianic figure of Aragorn in terms of a deep-rooted ancient bloodline coming finally into its own, and Gandalf, on the other hand, is the avatar of Manwë, of the divine. So he separated them, and which to me sort of is resonant of Judaism, whereas C.S. Lewis put them together, which is very much resonant of Christianity. And I'm wondering, is that something that you've encountered? What are your thoughts about the very, very different representations of the same essential impulses and the interactions with war and with fighting the good fight?
Thank you. Very interesting question. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right that the Christianity on display, as it were, much more implicitly in Middle-earth, is a Christianity or Christology which is, you might say, fractured. Aragorn the king and Gandalf, I mean, they're often split people say they're split three ways. Aragorn the king, Gandalf the prophet, and Frodo the priest. The prophet, priest, and king. Those three elements of the Christological office, and they're sort of spread out amongst different characters. Whereas, yes, you're quite right. In Narnia, you have a singular Christological character. And this is one of the interesting things, I think, about the implications of this planetary reading of Narnia, is that if my reading is right, then Lewis's Christology in Narnia is actually much more sophisticated. It's not just Aslan equals Jesus. It's much more like Aslan is the incarnate Logos, but the discarnate Logos, as it were, the Word which has made all things and in which all things hold together, is evident in the rest of the story and everything in it. Because, as I was talking about tonight, the martial spirit is evident in the other characters as they become knights, or as they become woodlanders, or as they discover little chess pieces, or as they, do whatever they do. It's all infused with that same Christological spirit, but discarnate. And I think that's a fascinating element of what Lewis is up to theologically. I think his theological imagination is much more interesting than people have given it credit for.
We've got time for one more question.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. You mentioned G.K. Chesterton. A quote by him is that angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. And I was just wondering, what's your perspective on G.K. Chesterton's view on heroism in life and C.S. Lewis's and Tolkien's?
Joe?
I'm not a scholar on Chesterton. I'm not really a scholar on Lewis and Tolkien, honestly. It's a terrific question, Wes. It seems to me there's a basic shared moral vision there, though, isn't there? I mean, Tolkien was a deeply committed believing Catholic, Lewis as an Anglican. And on the one hand, they had this hopefulness about human life and the human situation and the necessity of heroism despite all the odds. And yet there's this incredible realism and awareness of the problem of sin and guilt and the fall. And it seems to me you can find that all over Chesterton as well. So I don't see that much difference in their kind of their moral outlook. How they go about writing their fiction is another matter, and it's kind of beyond me. So I'm going to defer perhaps to Michael on that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know Chesterton half as well as I know Lewis, or for that matter Tolkien. So I can't say very much about this. But I do know that Lewis and a friend on the outbreak of the Second World War were, I think that they might have just begun to do their local defence volunteers duties, whereby or the Home Guard as it was called, whereby the men who weren't out at the front nonetheless thought that they better patrol the streets of England just in case some parachutists were dropping in for an advance attempt at an invasion. And so Lewis says that, one night in 3, I march about the darkest and most malodorous parts of Oxford with a rifle from 12 until 3, and then I go home to bed. And anyway, he said that, I think I'm getting this right, he and his comrade in arms who were doing this found themselves on the outbreak of war saying, well, it looks pretty bleak, doesn't it? And they said we couldn't do anything but start quoting Chesterton's The Ballad of the White Horse to one another. And I'm sure they had in mind that stanza which goes something like, I'm going to mangle it terribly, I offer you naught for your comfort, naught for your desire, save that the sun grows dark and the sea rises higher. That's a terrible misquotation, but it's something like that. And that actually rather undermines Lewis's point elsewhere that Chesterton was simply an enchanted poet of war. That quotation, at least, suggests he knew something of the darker side.
The idea, again, back to your earlier point, Michael, about doing your duty as part of the heroic ideal.
That's right, of the endurance.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you've certainly done your duty for us tonight, flying across the Atlantic in the metal coffin that is British Airways. Let's have a round of applause, if we could, for Michael.